Hello, everyone. My name is Donald Bice. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off with this breakout session. On the screen with me is Jeff Bailey and Tony Dorn, and I'll provide a little more information about them in the next slide before eventually turning it over to them to take us through other parts of the presentation today. Before I get started, I wanted to announce a few housekeeping issues. This session is being recorded. It will be available along with the question and answer transcripts and the slide deck. We can make those available. Closed caption is available using the closed caption button on the Zoom ribbon. And please use the question and answer button on the Zoom ribbon to submit your questions. So today in this breakout session, we're going to be talking a little bit more in depth, a little behind the curtain of producing and executing a census of agriculture. We don't have enough time to go through all of it, so this will be some general overviews, but we do want to leave some time at the back end to have to answer any questions that you might have. As always, Jeff and Tony and I are available after this for emails and things like that if you have specific questions about any of the material we cover. I would ask you probably to best coordinate that through a data users meeting coordinators, but we'll be certainly happy to answer any additional questions. So I did say my name is Donald Bice. I'm Chief of Census Planning Branch. Today, my portion of the presentation is going to be revolving around the planning and some of the planning and execution in terms of data collection of the Census of Agriculture. A lot of that is going to be about our mail list development. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Bailey, who is the Chief of Summary Estimation and Disclosure Methodology Branch, part of our methodology division. And Jeff is going to talk a little bit about where we are now with executing the census and how we go about applying our methodology to make sure we account for all farms with our official statistics. And then finally, Tony is going to take us to a quick preview of the abundance of data products that are available and only available from the Census of Agriculture program after a complete census is taken, following all our farm definitions and all our best practices in terms of statistical methodology and as a federal statistical agency. So in terms of executing the Census of Agriculture, in the statistical circles, we have kind of an expression that the data that you release is only as good as the data that you collect. Additionally, take that a step further, the data that you collect is really only as good as the list that you collect it from. So to that end, NASS is constantly and consistently trying to build and maintain the list of farmers that it has. To this point, we have an online sign up that's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, publicly available. So if anybody ever says, you know, I'd like to get believe it or not, this doesn't happen very often, but I'd like to get a Census of Agriculture, or I'd like to get a survey from NASS, we do allow people to sign up. As you would imagine, we don't get an abundance of people doing that, but we also set about all the time gathering lists from a variety of sources. Our regional field office staff are primarily the responsible parties for gathering, but really everybody's task in NASS is to be constantly looking for lists and processing the lists that we gather. These are typically from agricultural organizations or those entities related to agriculture, but we ingest those as many list sources as we can. Once we have that information, we like to do an ag screener, and this is a 4-page questionnaire that we send out to any potential producer. And we call it the National Agricultural Classification Survey. And in here, we're just really trying to identify any agriculture. We let this NAC survey, this ag screener, identify the agriculture that we can put onto our databases. But then eventually we will send out the Census of Agriculture questionnaire to these potential producers, and that is when we will qualify an individual as a farm. So again, our ag screener just looks for ag activity. Casts a very wide net, but the census then uses our parameters and our systems to qualify a producer or an operation as a farm or a farmer. As you see here, there's a certain cycle that goes on with the Census of Agriculture. Many of you are aware that the census is conducted only once every 5 years. And from that, there's certain rhythms and routines that you get into. One of those, and a lot of the time is and efforts spent between census years are for building our list, and that really starts with the closeout of the previous census. Now we're in a sort of a unique time where we're starting to plan for the 2027 census, even though the 2022 census has yet to be released. So we're kind of in both camps here, but in terms of our list building, that is really where we're starting to look forward to the 2027 census. And that'll start after we close out here, and we'll take all that information that we gather from the Census of Agriculture, and we'll update our databases of farmers and farms to get the most accurate information. That information then is used to help improve our sampling surveys, our sample surveys that are done between years. But we'll take that information and have that all available, and then we'll start that building process. And I talked about those lists that we gathered. Some of those have stacked up and we're ready to go. So we will start that National Agricultural Classification Survey for the 2022 Census of Agriculture. We started in 2019. Of course, for the 2027, we'll start the first ag screener in 2024. As you see here, we sort of build up. Typically, we have built up as we get closer to the actual census in terms of the size of these ag screeners. They sort of slowly build till we end up in the reference year. This past reference year of 2022, we had a last ag screener that consisted of over 1 million records of those million potential farms. So as we move through this cycle and we build our list, we'll eventually in 2022 we finalize our list. You fast forward 5 years, in 2027 we'll be finalizing our census mail list at that time. Also in that reference year is important because we have to also take into account that this is not a perfect list that we're building, and so we want to make sure that we take the proper statistical best practices to determine how good our list is and how much coverage our list has. And to do that, we conduct an area coverage evaluation survey. This is really where the census data collection starts. The more traditional census questionnaire that mails out at the end of the year really is what most people think of. However, again, the data collection starts with this area coverage evaluation survey. We do that. Many of you might be familiar with our June area survey. It is done in supplement to that. So we still conduct the June area survey, but we add additional segments to it, areas of land that we're going to collect data on, that we're going to do a full enumeration. We're going to use that information to see if we already have that individual that's operating that piece of land on our list. If we don't, then we're building a separate frame to help measure the coverage. Now, Jeff is going to get into some of the details of the methodology. I'm not going to pretend to have a great deal of depth in it, but I'll just tell you that's as part of what was critical methodology that's called the dual system estimation. I refer to it, and it's often more familiarly referred to as a capture recapture. Effectively, we're capturing data in this area survey, and then we'll build a list, and then we'll send out of those that we do not have already on our list, and we'll send them a census questionnaire. That's the recapture part. So that's the dual system estimator, capture, recapture. Capture in June, and then send them a questionnaire and capture the data during the census, and then compare that and make some adjustments based on that. One of the things that does, as I've talked about, is that provides a measure of our coverage, or really how well our census mail list is doing. Again, Jeff is going to go into detail about applying the methodology in the execution of the census. In terms of the other data collection, the stuff that most folks are familiar with in terms of our big process and production of the Census of Agriculture, this is a complete accounting of all the correspondence and all the instances that we had in terms of trying to collect data this past time. I'm not going to go through these individually, but I want to highlight a couple things. One is we really had two objectives in our data collection strategy. The first objective is to get as many returns as possible, whether they're actual businesses, farm businesses, or they're not businesses. We want that information. So that was the first objective we had. And the second objective was to continue to increase our online reporting. And so we did a great deal of highlighting. To that end of pushing online or encouraging online, we had a couple separate mailings that were effectively, instead of mailing a questionnaire, we sent an invitation with the secure coding to get into the online instrument to encourage producers to use that vehicle to report their data. And then finally, the last point I want to make about our strategy is to the means to the end of trying to get as many returns as possible. At the very end of the census data collection period, we were in response to producers and other groups suggesting that maybe we try to use a very reduced form just to identify whether somebody was actually a farm or out of business. And so we did that with a 4-page farm status form. That was the last instance of correspondence that went out for our data collection strategy. Let's talk a little bit about metrics. I won't go into a great deal of metrics, but this graph here shows the returns for the census historically by mode. And you see with the 2022 at the furthest to the left, the most recent year, you see this steady decline in the number of mail responses. Meanwhile, the online responses have had a steady rise. Now, I wish I could report that these completely offset each other. They do not. However, it does go to show that there is a trend, a shift in the data collection mode that's for the Census of Agriculture. And we're very strong. We're strongly encouraging producers to do that, and we're very pleased with our efforts and the advancements we've made in making this form available online. Looking at that, you would anticipate the next census to be close to that tipping point where we perhaps would have more online responses than mail responses. But for now, we have to be attentive to our producers and our audience, the target audience for our data collection. A lot of them want paper questionnaires. And so we will continue to use paper mailings as long as we are able to gather information from those that qualify. At some point, though, we are starting to take a look at more emphasis will be placed on online responding, I'm sure. The final screen I have is really just sort of a general overview of the schedule for the Census of Agriculture, kind of where we were and where we are now. You can see this is basically a 14-month execution, although a lot of milestones have to be met in the 4 years prior to the actual census going out. The actual census itself runs for 14 months, starting in late November and ending in early 2024. Late November of 2022 and early 2024 for the release. In terms of where we are now, that we are in this period of time where we're doing a lot of data analysis and data review, and also we've started and have been doing our making our statistical adjustments that Jeff will talk about here in just less than a minute as I close things down. But we're also sort of keeping an eye on the big prize, and that is the release. And so in December, starting around December, I really it's already started, but really when we get into December, we'll really start our primary focus on getting prepared for the release in February. So with that, I will thank you for your time and consideration this morning, and I'll hand it over to my colleague Jeff to take us into some statistical methodology talk. Jeff, the floor is yours.
All right, Donald, thank you very much. Good afternoon or good morning, depends on where you're at, I guess. I want to provide a little bit of information about the statistical weighting methodology used for our Census of Agriculture. And as Donald mentioned, the goal was to accurately measure all U.S. farms in the United States. And to do that, we make adjustments for census deficiencies, we could say. The first adjustment is a coverage adjustment. Our census mail list is incomplete, despite working continuously to keep it up to date. Our coverage is measured, as Donald mentioned, by the Agriculture Coverage Evaluation Survey. and that's used to help us do our coverage adjustment. Secondly, for the 22 census, we have a response rate of about 61%. So we know that there are many who did not respond that are farms. So we have weight adjustments to account for those non-respondents. Thirdly, we have misclassification of farms, both under and over count, that we adjust for. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's the weighted adjustments for the 2017 Census of Agriculture. The largest adjustment is the coverage adjustment at 15.1%, followed by the non-response adjustment of 13.9%, and lastly, the misclassification adjustment of 8.6%. This is for the number of farms, the adjustments that we made in the 2017 Census of Agriculture. So those numbers are all published in appendix table A of the appendix. Here's a little clip from that appendix. And so for major items, the adjustment as a percent of total is provided. In the first little box there, we've got the total for the 2017 Census of Agriculture. The total adjustment for farm numbers was 37.6%. While for land and farms, it was 22.7%. Every item is different. The three adjustment components are in the next little box there, and they're provided in the tables. And we can see that the coverage adjustment for farms was 15.1%, and for lands, it was 4.4%. And this is because bigger farms are more likely to be on our list, and conversely, we're missing more smaller farms. Next slide. Good. So in all surveys and censuses, there are inaccuracies, and the numbers are best available, but they are not necessarily the truth because we don't know the truth. But we can quantify the measures of the variability due to those weight adjustments. And so other errors, though, such as non-sampling errors, they are difficult to measure and will occur, but with diligence, we do try to minimize the non-sampling errors. So table A of the appendix also provides the measure availability for those major items, the measure of errors due to the weighting adjustments. The standard error for farms in the 2017 Census of Agriculture was 43,278. And we published that standard error for all the major items. And you can see from that, the calculation there on the screen, you can see how we can calculate a 95% confidence interval. And when you do that, the confidence interval shows a range of 1.957 million to 2.127 million. When you take the standard error and divide it by the estimate, we also get coefficient of variations, or CVs as we refer to them. The CVs for all items are published in the QuickStats database, our online database of estimates. So that gives you, for each item, you can know what the measure of error, measure availability is for each of the items. Another important part of our process is disclosure protections. And first and foremost, the law, regulations, and our policies all require us to protect the data that's reported to us. Data are to be used for only statistical purposes. So accordingly, we pledge to keep individual information confidential. We want to protect the data reported to us, and that will help us to maintain our trust of all our data providers. So how do we protect our data? First and foremost, if there's only one or two reports, a cell value will be suppressed because we wouldn't want to publish anybody's report or want a competitor to know what somebody else's number have. Then secondly, if there are more than three, we calculate to see if there's any report is a dominant. So for the Census of Agriculture, for dominance, we take the published value and then subtract the two largest reports. Then we take that remainder. When the remainder is less than P% of the largest report, the cell is suppressed. And then to add protection, we do not disclose the value of P. So that's how we calculate dominance. Thirdly, though, in a table, we suppress additional cells, which we sometimes refer to as complementary cells, to prevent deriving the value of the primary cells, the cells that had dominance. For example, if we suppress the value of one state, its value could be derived by adding up all the other states and subtracting from the US total. So therefore, we have to suppress a second state value. So here's an example to show you what we do with disclosure. This is for the state of Mississippi. And so you can see that there's only, there in the middle, you can see there's only one farm with bananas. And so that acres for that one farm is suppressed. So bananas is a primary suppression. Now we have two other Ds. We have Ds suppressed values for California and for Texas. One or both may have a dominant farm and be a primary, or both may be necessary to protect Mississippi. We can't know from the published table. So suppressed values are represented as Ds. D is in for disclosure. So hope that's helpful to understand what we do to protect our data. And this concludes our methodology section, and Tony Dorn will now talk about our products.
All right, thank you, Jeff. And as you can see, the census is a very large project. So we have a very wide variety and numerous products that we're producing out of the Census of Agriculture. And looking ahead, what we'll be producing for products, we'll have very similar products that we had in 2017. And the hemp special studies will be added as a custom census product. And the schedule of key products, those will be on the SB calendar. And similar to before, some of the special products will be released with the Census of Agriculture, and others will be released later in the year. There's so many products, we can't release everything on one day, and plus that gives another day for more highlights and people to be able to spotlight that data. In addition, the Ag Census web maps will be available like they were before, but there were 16 dot density Ag Atlas maps that will be discontinued because they're redundant and already shown on the other Ag Census web maps. And we also plan a prototype story map for demographics to see how that works and how data users will receive that and can use that, and to see its popularity if we expand or do anything different along the lines of Esri story maps. Taking a look at rather just a long list of products, this kind of bubble diagram maybe shows how we can categorize and look at the products and get them into some kind of order. As far as the main reports, you see on the left side of the screen, the main reports out of the Census of Agriculture and related products are the US by tables, the states by table, Appendix A and B, the county level data, Puerto Rico, Guam, US Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands. And on the top right, the online resources that we have are quick stats, maps, highlights, zip code tabulations. And the subject series, we have American Indian reservations, watersheds, typology, specialty crops. And then down below, the final category of rankings and profiles, we have state and county rankings and profiles, race, ethnicity, gender, market value of ag products, and also congressional districts. Moving on, just the main volumes and the products released with the Census of Agriculture, the main web pages there. We have a fairly well organized website where we have the US Volume 1, State Volume 1, Ag Census Highlights, and Subject Series for 2017, 2012, and so on back a few years, that you can quickly get census data as you need, especially for the Volume 1s fairly easily and consistently. So the products released soon after the census, this is kind of another way to look at the timing rather than organization. So the products that will be released soon after the census are state profiles, county profiles, rankings, the market value of ag products sold, congressional district profiles, race, ethnicity, and gender profiles, watersheds, American Indian reservations, Ag Census web maps, specialty crops, and zip code tabulations. Then after 2024 and the following year, of course, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, US Virgin Islands, American Samoa, specialty crops for outlying areas, and then typology and history will be released the year after that. Then looking at the census special studies, we have a 5-year cycle, as Donald kind of mentioned. The census is a cycle, and a lot of the census follow-on special studies, obviously, it's with the amount of resources and burden on farmers to report. We spread that all over 5 years so that we can produce those efficiently using resources and not burden the farmers too much as far as spreading that out. So everything, is really not possible to produce in 1 year. So we have a cycle of rotation. So as I mentioned, I think in the main program, the Irrigation and Water Management Survey and Census of Agriculture are coming up in 2023. And in 2024, total, the 10-year ownership and transition of agricultural land, which is really land ownership surveys coming up, as well as the Census of Horticulture in the 2024 reference year. And 2025 organic survey and local foods marketing practices really is the final product in all this series. So that's just the normal cycle that we anticipate, unless something changes, but that's where we anticipate going the next several years with census data products. And after that, I'll leave it up to questions for us. I think there's a few in Q&A that we can maybe start with, and that's all I had. All right. It looks like the first question, I don't know if you can see that too, Donald and Jeff, is that at some point would NASS be willing to tell us who they get the list from by specific livestock? We would like to know who they get their lists from for horses. And I guess, for instance, I can start that if you want. Is that okay with everybody? Yeah, as far as the answer, we do collect, just anything we can get a list from. We're trying to measure, any farm, a farm definition of a farm. A lot of you know it starts with $1,000 of sales, or normally $1,000 of sales. So one farm, a small farm, is as big as a large farm, and farm numbers are really one of the big measures, important measures that we have in the Census of Agriculture. So we're looking for lists of all sizes and types of farms. So there's so many lists that we get at state level, regional level, local levels, things like that. We get such a wide variety of lists and multiple sources that we don't have specific sources of those lists that we track throughout the years, because once a farm is on our list frame, we might get another list, things like that. So it's really just a large volume and just how our processes go. We don't have tracking as far as which specifically sources are related to which ones, and that also kind of relates to our disclosure information. We don't disclose any individual information as far as something that might track to where other people we could be getting their information from, where they might be located, what they might be producing. So there isn't really anything necessarily that we track, so we don't have a source for that type of information where the original farms were identified with. And I don't know, Jeff, Donald, if you want to add to that, but that's a start.
I'll just say a few things. One of the things that works for us, in particular for horses, is a lot of states we've had entered into external project agreements to do an equine survey. So we do, when that happens in that particular state, we will obviously do exhaustive measures to do it, gather additional lists. And I would always encourage folks, if they have a list that they are able to secure for us and provide to us, we will take it in, and we have pretty sophisticated programming that looks, we might already have the individual on our list, but we take all lists, and if they're done in electronic format, we can quickly, I shouldn't say quickly, but we can run them through our programs to identify those records that we don't have any indication of having an operator or an operator producer or operation, and they'll get an ag screener, and then they can tell us about their horse population provided that it's on their farm.
All right, thank you, Donald.
I'll start. I'll read the next one, Tony, if you want. I know that you mentioned about the prototype maps. So the question is, do you have a screenshot of what the prototype story maps will look like? I'm guessing that it's not something that you have handy, Tony, but
yeah,
is there one that exists at all?
that's a great question. I was looking, it's under Esri, the GIS company. We don't have a screenshot. Unfortunately, I don't have a screenshot. It would have probably been a great idea looking back, and maybe we can do that in future to bring kind of a demo of what a story map is. But in describing it, it's really kind of like a more interactive. It's kind of between video and the presentation. So it kind of is interactive, it's kind of lively, so it moves from one story to the next. So it's really interesting and can kind of tell a story over time, especially how, like in this case, demographics would change and different states, counties, things like that over time. So it's really neat interactively, not so neat describing it verbally. I know it'd be much better to see it. So that's something I'll take back, and maybe we can incorporate that into future data users too, just to have a short snippet of that in. But that's a great idea. I don't have an image. You can Google, there are things, if you Google the Esri story map, you can probably get a little bit of an idea of what it is, but I don't have a snapshot right here, unfortunately. But great question. Thank you.
All right, the next question, I'll keep rolling through these. Are those special census studies open for public comment via the Federal Register? If that is the case, is there an option to submit a new special studies topic? So a couple things here. When we do we don't actually do a Federal Register posting to announce our schedule for those. We do try to make those available publicly upon request, but we don't. The answer is no on the Federal Register. Now, when we go out to do a particular special study, we of course do a Federal Register notice to announce that survey is coming. But I'm thinking that that's not the intent of the question. And then in terms of the submitting a new one, I believe there is a place online that we do gather that information. If you have a suggestion, I don't know the link right off the top of my head, but we probably can provide that information or do a search in our NASS, the USDA NASS's area for ag input. But we can certainly try to get that link to you. We have in the past, there has been some submissions to that. We do take in those submissions, and then of course we'll determine how best to go about it. But in terms of our Census of Agriculture program funding, those special studies that you have, the funding that we get from year to year is aligned with those programs. So if we were to do a new study, there would have to be accompanying appropriation dollars associated with that into our Census of Agriculture program. The other avenue is to do our external project agreement or reimbursable surveys, particularly if there's a particular data need for a more local geographic region looking into into a specific practice or a specific commodity. What are you doing to reduce survey fatigue? This is a good question. It's one that we don't have a stock answer for right now, but it has been coming up fairly regularly. So I'll start and I'll turn it over to Tony and Jeff if they have anything to add. But a couple ways we do this is we try to coordinate surveys. We try to, in our sampling procedures, we try to take into account. So before a farmer is included in a survey, we try to take best practices to reduce the burden. But the reality is some farmers land in a lot of surveys, and this fatigue is a real thing. On the other side of that is there has been no reduction in the amount of data that is being requested or information that that the public would like to be made available. So somewhere in the middle, we hope to find a good balance. But we recognize, and I think for addressing an issue, the first thing to do really is to recognize that there's a problem and then look at steps that you can take to minimize that. So I don't have any specifics for that today, but just know that the USDA NASS is aware of this issue, and we are going to taking measures to try to address it.
Yeah, Donald, maybe if I could add a little bit too, we are really looking at any types of administrative data we can use too as well to supplement, the survey data that we have. I mean, the best data really is the data from the farmer. They know about their operation best, but we're looking for any types of information. You probably heard in different crop sessions using satellite data, other data sources, things like that, where we can really enhance and hopefully, eventually as much as we could, replace any questions that would be redundant with other information we could get. But it's very, we really are exploring that area. We're doing everything we can to reduce that survey fatigue, because there is, like Donald said, there's just more and more data. People want more and more detailed data, more data at a detailed level too. So, I mean, it's a tough balance that we really have to keep in mind. And, our source of data is the farmers. So we have to really be the guardians to make sure that we can minimize the burden on them everywhere we can. And we've talked about many times, we often talk about that. That's always on our minds too. How can we minimize burden on farmers? Because we want to do what's best for them and for agriculture. And we have to be that kind of safeguard and have that balance ourselves. So definitely we talk about that very frequently, and administrative data is one way, and we're looking at any type of data that we can use to help reduce that.
Thank you, Tony. The next question is, are there county estimates the same as 2017, or have you added or removed any measures? I'm not sure I'm precisely understand the question, but I do know that from the 2022 census, much of the data is almost matches what was in 2017. So there would be able to be comparisons made between those data points. I can't off the top of my head think of any items that we removed in terms of what we added. Tony, maybe you off the top of your head know a sort of a catalog of those very few items that we've added. I do want to say, I think precision agriculture, we added an item on precision agriculture to measure the number of farms using it. Anything else I'm missing on that, Tony?
Hemp, and I think maybe some local food practices, we maybe streamline things like that. So there's some minor changes, but even though there's might be methodology we've improved or changed, it's still, the comparison still is the same. We're publishing the same thing. There's not a break in the data series at all. It's the same comparisons. And like Donald said, we changed a very few things. Hemp was an addition, but for the most part, it's very comparable, and it's meant to be comparable between the data series to keep that going.
Anything to add, Jeff?
No, that's good.
All right. The last question I see here, we'll certainly, we've got a little more time on this session. If there's any other questions, please feel free to type them in. This question is, are there any types of non-agriculture sources that feed the NASS lists? For example, are there sources that could lead to non-producer receiving a survey? If so, can you give an example? This is an unfortunate circumstance or scenario that plays out when because of our gathering of lists. We do often we try to get lists that are agriculture related. Yes, absolutely. But then we do oftentimes get lists that are that have additional names on it that will get a survey. And that should not have. As an example, I think there was a question about the horses. So an equine list might be a good example where you might have somebody on the equine list that we gather that is simply a fan of horses, or they've joined a trade organization because they're involved in some sort of horse sales or products associated with horses. So their name would land on the list, and then if we did not have them already on our list of farms, then we would send them a NASS survey. At which time we would provide them they would should be able to easily screen out. And then once they've screened, that individual is screened out, they shouldn't be troubled unless they were to happen to, say, find their way onto another list source that we gather. So it's something that we take measures to try to eliminate, but there are occasions where this happens. Jeff or Tony, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we can, also say that, sometimes we may think somebody's an operator, it turns out to be a landlord. They may be a producer, but if they don't have equivalent of $1,000 of sales, they wouldn't be qualified as a farm. So those are additional, there's lots of little reasons that, that may happen, that they may not be a farm in the end.
Yeah, well, one of the things we constantly stress in our correspondence and in our public relations or even press releases is that if you receive a NASS questionnaire or a Census of Agriculture questionnaire and are not a farmer, do not have any activity, the best way for us to really stop troubling the individual is to respond appropriately, saying that you do not farm or do not have any ag activity, and then it's a quick way for us to update our records and stop from getting any more correspondence.
If you did notice, Marissa did put the link to the submission form for comments to the Census of Ag program.
I did not. So thank you for letting me know, and thank you, Marissa, for doing that. I'm not seeing any more questions for now, but I think we were told to try to wrap things up about 5 till. So it looks like we've got about 10 more minutes, a little under 10 minutes, if anybody else has any questions.
Okay, I do have another question there. Maybe I'll take first chance at this one. Is there any information or study, et cetera, about overlapping between USDA and other federal statistical data collection efforts? So, Donald mentioned the OMB survey process, Office of Agent Budget approval process for surveys. Basically, one of the questions they ask us when we request to do a survey is there another source of data? So it needs to be unique. And so generally there is not overlap between surveys. There are some discussions too, as far as, the NAICS that we cover versus the NAICS that other agencies cover. And, there is a separation there. We are covering certain NAIC industries that and sometimes in some areas that gets a little bit difficult to distinguish, but so we shouldn't be covering the same thing as other agencies, generally speaking. I don't know if Tony, don't have any more to add to that.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jeff. That's the main point. So yeah, like you said, we're trying to minimize burden on farmers. So we're all, we're glad that OMB is doing that as a check and everything to make sure we don't overlap and burden farmers unnecessarily.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add except that we really do try to stay in our lanes in terms of our surveys associated with farm operations and an organization like the Department of Commerce, the Census Bureau. They're dealing with establishment surveys as well, but those would be retail, manufacturing. So things that really should be clear divides between the federal statistical agencies anyway. Oh, there are. So I should just scroll down. I'm sorry about that. I think I missed a couple because I didn't scroll down. Let's see. From Emily, what's the best way to contact with further questions regarding NASS census and data collection processes after the webinar? I'm not sure the best way to, if we want to coordinate these through the sort of a centralized data user, but if you would like to, Emily or anyone else, if you have specific questions about the data collection process, someone, myself or some of my staff would likely end up handling that question. And so you should, if you don't have our contact information, we can provide that, and we can do our best to answer any specific questions that you might have, whether it's census related or surveys. All right. The question, can you tell me a little bit about how you collect aquaculture data and the census of aquaculture? It seems that some of the aquaculture data is withheld, leading to more data gaps for other agencies looking for aquaculture data. Let me start by saying how we collect the aquaculture data. We do a census of aquaculture, and that is a follow-on special studies to the census of agriculture. And so the census of agriculture has a section on aquaculture, and we screen, as a sort of a screener. And so anybody that responds that they have any aquaculture production, regardless of the amount, is then eligible for the census of aquaculture, at which time we would follow up and get a more detailed look at that operation and its aquaculture production. In terms of withholding data, I think that Jeff touched on the as far as the disclosure programming that we take our confidentiality very seriously, and so we have very rigorous disclosure programming both for the census of agriculture and for aquaculture. So I feel reasonably certain in saying I'll lean on Jeff for the final say on this, but that disclosure programming that we run is deliberate to make sure that we're not disclosing any individual operators data. So I think those data gaps that exist from them are absolutely important for us to maintain our confidentiality pledge.
And if I could add quickly too, aquaculture is really, I guess, presents a special challenge when it comes to disclosure, because there's so many specialized, commodity items. I mean, from, crawfish, trout, salmon, everything, oysters. So there's a whole bunch of different disclosure items within aquaculture where we can't, reveal into individual producers. So it does present even a little bit more additional challenges because there's so many different and concentrated producers. So that is also a little bit extra for aquaculture, since the commodities are so varied and specialized and regional and all that. So it's definitely something that we fit in, make sure the confidentiality is withheld, but it is a little bit more of a challenge in aquaculture.
I could take the next one. It was mentioned that the return rate or sampling rate is variable among different size producers. Is the variance reported for each farm size or by what is produced? If not the case, is that being considered? So yeah, return rates are variable by size, and so we do get different return rates, and so the non-response adjustment could be different by size. We do the table Appendix A publishes the coverage adjustments by size, I believe, and certainly all the statistics in QuickStats has the coefficient of variation for every item. So the variability overall is published for every item, and we have a lot of items by size and by acreage size and by what is produced. And so you can see for each item, you can figure out, you can look and see what the variability actually is.
Well, it's like we're coming up on the top of the hour. We probably have time for one or two more questions is all. So happy to address anything that any last questions. We did get a, not a census question per se, but is there a minimum maximum quantity for acreage of commodities to be removed and added back into the annual NASS surveys? I think that becomes a sampling question. I'll start by saying, and then maybe I'll lean on Jeff. I know you've got some sampling in your background. The samples that we draw for the NASS surveys are going to be based on the information, a lot of the information that's reported from previous surveys, the census included in that, and obviously the most copious amounts of returns and information provided back to our list. Then the sampling actually would take into account, try to take into account the various strata or the various groups of records that are represented on a frame. So I think to that point, there may not be a minimum but I think that probably the smaller, the less acreage they have, or the amount of the commodity, the less likely they would be sampled. Jeff, if you wanna save me on that one.
So you did exactly right. The smaller they are, the less probability of being in a sample. I'm not sure what the question is getting at though, but Tony might want to speak to it. We do an annual 5-year revision, or 5-year revision, but we also annual program review. And so determines what states are in the program or not based on after we complete the census. And so, we might move states in and out of the programs for different commodities as well, so that we get we got the right states in our program.
Yeah, that may be a little bit more the angle. I think the question possibly too, touching on like the program review a little bit, because after the census, we go through, in addition to sampling, we also go through acreages of certain commodities, might include or exclude states, just because of the change in the level of production of those commodities. And we go through a program review, and there'll be an ASB notice and everything out there as far as the timing and what we're doing for that from the results, if that's where that question is really coming from. Right, I think we're heading up towards a break time for our next session. Wouldn't you say, panelists?
Yeah, I think so. One more thing, before anybody out there that is on the meeting today that's a farm producer, I want to take the opportunity to thank them for helping us out and reporting on the Census of Agriculture. And it's the respondents that make the data, as I said before. So the data is only as good as that's collected. So thanks to all the producers out there for providing their information.